Are we on?
We're on.
All right. Well, hello and welcome back. And to those who are watching this online, we haven't seen you for a couple of weeks now. Sorry about the little glitch last week. I would like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what we discussed last week, some of the ideas from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Ethics, partly just so we can have some of that on video, and partly just because I think the review will be helpful for us, because we'll see some of those same ideas emerging in the letters and papers from prison, and we'll see how Bonhoeffer was able to develop those. I'll skip all the nerdy stuff about about how Bonhoeffer's book Ethics came to be, how it came to be written first of all, and then edited later on by Eberhard Bethge and by the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works folks. That nerds like me love that stuff, but for our purposes, what's important is the ideas. And so you'll remember that Bonhoeffer wanted to create a very kind of fresh and different approach to Christian ethics. Most ethical thought, he said, was based on either principles or consequences or virtues, but in his view, Christian ethics should be based on one fundamental idea, and that was the conformation to Christ's vicarious representative action. And that means that Christians are to, in a sense, allow their lives to be conformed to the pattern of Christ's life. As our authors indicate, that doesn't necessarily mean just kind of asking what would Jesus do, because in a lot of cases we don't know what Jesus would have done in situations that Jesus never faced. But it's really more a matter of how can we allow Christ indwelling us to conform our lives to the pattern of his vicarious representative action. And there's that concept, Stellvertretung, right? That concept that's so important for him. And it's important to remember that it's not just a matter for Bonhoeffer of Christ's cross being somehow a vicarious atonement for our sins. Vicarious representative action really represents Christ's work from beginning to end. So he talks about the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection as all being part of that pattern. And in a sense, that means that because Christ was incarnate as part of our reality, that accordance with reality, right? Our actions need to be in accord with reality. This is the reality that God loved. And if our actions are based on some kind of ideal that isn't really a part of reality, then we're not really being faithful to Christ's vicarious representative action in the incarnation. And equally, in the cross, Christ assumed our guilt. He stood beside us, in a sense, as part of humanity and said, I'm willing to, I'm not setting myself above humanity. And so we in our ethical action have to be willing to become guilty. Schuldübernahme was the kind of the German term that he used for that. We can't hold ourselves above the rest of humanity as if somehow we're a little bit better. And then in the resurrection, Christ opened new possibilities for what it means to be fully human in this world, in this reality. And so part of our ethical action has to be maintaining our freedom for what he calls the concrete venture, or Wagnis in German. We can't be bound, in a sense, by the past and by rigid principles. We have to be willing, in a sense, to follow God's call wherever it leads us.
But can you say
Can
you say the German word?
Oh, Wirklichkeitsgemessheit.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah, you need a lot of spit for that. Right? Okay. Now, Bonhoeffer is going to argue that principles and consequences and virtues are in fact relevant. They're things that you have to think about, but they're secondary. And the primary question in ethics has to be, how can we follow the call of God? And Bonhoeffer suggested that he really wanted to call his book, if he had ever had a chance to finish it, Preparing the Way. We, in our ethical action, can't really bring the kingdom of God, but we can prepare the way for it. Right? And that's what we're called to do. And so we have to somehow hear and discern what the call of God is in each situation for each one of us. And the challenge is going to be, according to Bonhoeffer, that it's not always going to be the same depending on the situation and depending on the individual. We're not all alike. We're not all called to the same thing. That, of course, is going to be part of Bonhoeffer's discernment when he decides to come back from New York to Germany in 1939. He wasn't necessarily saying this is the right thing for everybody. He was saying this is what I think I am called to do. And I need to be faithful to that call. So reason and intuition in Scripture are all vital parts of this discernment. So that's just a quick review of some of the ideas from ethics. But today our emphasis is going to be on the collection of documents, of letters and poetry and other short essays, and in one case, a couple of different cases, a sermon, one sermon that he wrote for the wedding of his friend Eberhard Bethge to his niece. Bethge kind of married into the Bonhoeffer family. And because Bonhoeffer was not able to attend that wedding, he wrote a sermon for it and said, use this if you want to. A year later, when Bethge's son was born, Bonhoeffer kind of smuggled out of prison a baptism sermon, and we're going to consider some of the language from that baptism sermon as well. So it's quite a fascinating collection of literature, and from the mid-1950s, when it was first published in German and translated into English, it has kind of captured the attention of a lot of people. Some of the language in it is rather puzzling, rather audacious, and people have kind of struggled to figure out what Bonhoeffer was up to, what he meant by the language that we find in the letters and papers. I think it's always helpful to take a look at the publishing history of the letters and papers from prison. This is a book with a biography. And in fact, Martin Marty, some of you might be familiar with him. He is kind of the dean of American church historians in the last generation. And he wrote a book entitled Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison, Biography. Right? It's not a biography of Bonhoeffer, it's a biography of the letters and papers from prison, right? Because the book has a history. I don't have the first edition that was published in English back in the mid-1950s under the title Prisoner for God. It would be a very slim volume. The first exposure that I had to it was this little paperback, Letters and Papers from Prison, published back in the 1960s. And then eventually I had to buy the new greatly enlarged edition in the early 1970s. And then, of course, eventually this weighty volume comes out, Letters and Papers from Prison, in 2009, I believe, in English translation. And of course, it's got all the nerdy notes in it that people like me love, and lots of additional documentation. But the core of the book is still basically the same. a lot of ways. The extra material helps us maybe understand that core, but the core hasn't really changed since the very first publication. It'll help us, I think, to remember the situation, the circumstances in which this material came into existence, just as we did with Bonhoeffer's ethics, and kind of getting a sense of the circumstances under which he wrote those manuscripts. On April 5th, 1943, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, were arrested by the Gestapo and placed in a military prison, Tegel prison in Berlin. They were arrested on suspicion and basically were held for interrogation. Under Hitler's dictatorship, and really under any dictatorship, you get a situation where you have one person who has ultimate control of everything, but underneath that, there are all these different agencies and departments that have their own purposes and their own personnel, and they're competing and jostling each other and so forth. And of course, as we found out last week, the Abwehr, German military intelligence unit, had become a center of resistance to Hitler. And it was kind of the nerve center of this conspiracy to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Nazis. But of course, that was all secret. There were people in competing organizations such as the security police, the Gestapo, who were sure something was up, but they didn't have any evidence. But they found a pretext to begin arresting some of the people associated with the Abwehr, particularly Bonhoeffer and Hans von Dohnanyi, and they figured, we'll interrogate them and we'll get it out of them what's going on there. So whether Bonhoeffer was actually going to be charged with anything and tried for anything wasn't really clear, but he was interrogated over the course of the year, and he and Dohnanyi appear to have successfully concealed the conspiracy from the Nazis. They had made plans in advance for what they were going to say if they were interrogated, and they stuck to the script and were able, in some cases, to communicate with each other through a rather elaborate code. Bonhoeffer's parents would bring him books, and letters on various pages would be circled, and you could kind of reconstruct a message. And so through means like that, Bonhoeffer was able to kind of maintain the secrecy of the conspiracy over the course of the time that he was at Tegel prison. About 13 months later, on April 30th, 1944, Bonhoeffer sent a letter to Bethge. He was basically, he was allowed to write a few letters, but those, of course, would be edited, censored, and anything he said in those letters, of course, would be known to the authorities. But because Bonhoeffer had contacts, you might say, his uncle was the military commandant of Berlin and therefore officially in charge of Tegel prison. And so once that was discovered, they treated him with a little bit of difference and gave him maybe a little bit of freedom. And part of that was that he was able, in a sense, to cultivate a relationship with a friendly, a sympathetic guard who then began to smuggle out letters to Bethge and to some other people. And so a lot of these letters that we have were part of those letters that were smuggled out of Tegel prison. And there's a particular series of letters starting on April 30th, 1944, that are sometimes called the theological letters. And these are letters that in which Bonhoeffer seems to kind of say, there's some ideas I want to get down on paper, and I want to find out what my friend Eberhard Bethge thinks about them. And so I'm just going to start to write, letters with a particular focus on getting those ideas on paper. A few months after that, on the 20th of July, 1944, the attempt to assassinate Hitler that was known as Operation Valkyrie fails. And in the aftermath of that, it was pretty clear that the conspiracy was now going to be out in the open, and the people who were associated with it were pretty much doomed, right? Bonhoeffer knew by the 21st of July, 1944, that unless the Allies won the war very, very quickly, there was just no way he was going to get out of this alive. In October, he was transferred to a Gestapo prison in Berlin, which with much greater security. And after that, we hear very little from Bonhoeffer himself. Very few letters or writings got out, and certainly not any of the smuggled letters that he was able to get out at Tegel. And on the 9th of April, 1945, just a bit over 2 years after his arrest, he was tried and executed at Flossenburg concentration camp. And then, of course, about a month later, on the 7th of May, the war comes to an end. So, he came that close, but things didn't somehow transpire quickly enough. And Hitler was determined, of course, that anyone even remotely associated with this conspiracy was not going to survive. And so even in the chaos of the Allied invasion of Germany, he managed to somehow keep these trials going and these executions going. At about the same time, Hans von Dohnanyi and Bonhoeffer's older brother Klaus Bonhoeffer and his another brother-in-law, Rüdiger Schleicher, who was also Eberhard Bethge's father-in-law, were also executed. So 2 brothers and 2 brothers-in-law of the Bonhoeffer family were executed by the end of the war. So the book was first published in German as Widerstand und Ergebung, which means resistance and submission. Because one of the themes that Bonhoeffer develops in these letters is how do you kind of combine resistance to evil on the one hand with submission to the will of God on the other hand. And so that was the theme that Bethge picked to give a title to the book. In English, the title chosen was Prisoner for God. But later, as the book came to be expanded and revised, it was generally referred to as Letters and Papers from Prison. In addition to that, in the early 1990s, this book was published in English. It's called Love Letters from Cell 92, and it's Bonhoeffer's letters to his fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer, to whom he had become engaged just literally weeks before his arrest. And that's a fascinating story in its own right. We don't have time to get into it. She was a rather remarkable person, only 18 years old when she became engaged to Bonhoeffer, but she had already been through a lot. People grew up fast in those days. And she later on came to America, attended college here in America, and became a mathematician and an early computer science expert. She got in on the ground floor of the computer science industry and had quite an interesting career of her own. But eventually, after her death, she left these a whole cache of letters to and from Bonhoeffer to be published. So that was kind of a bonus that we got, and an opportunity to see what Bonhoeffer was writing to Maria at the same time he was writing these letters to Eberhard Bethge. The very first of those theological letters, the April 30 letter, is one that I think yet we have to pay a lot of attention to. And I've just got a couple of short excerpts from it here. Bonhoeffer says, "What keeps gnawing at me is the question, what is Christianity, or who is Christ actually for us today?" And he says, "We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore." Be interesting to discuss whether we think he was right in that assessment, or at least whether that assessment applies to everywhere in the world. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. How can Christ become Lord of the religionless as well? Is there such a thing as religionless Christianity? And there he uses that word that has been such a puzzling term for so many decades for people, trying to figure out what does he mean by religionless Christianity? If religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and even this garb has looked very different in different ages, what then is a religionless Christianity? The Bonhoeffer goes on to say, the questions to be answered would be, what does a church, a congregation, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? How do we talk about God without religion? That is, without the temporally conditioned presuppositions of metaphysics, the inner life, and so on. How do we speak, or perhaps we can no longer even speak the way we used to, about God? So, what do you notice about that passage? Anything strike you about it? Yeah.
So he didn't have the garb of religion around it at all.
He didn't have
the garb of religion in prison.
Yeah. He has been pointing that out to Becky in previous letters. He's been saying, you know, I'm pretty isolated here. You know, back when he wrote the Communion of the Saints and Life Together, he was saying, you know, Christians yearn for the presence of other Christians. And he was saying, yeah, I still yearn for the presence of other Christians, but at the same time, I'm just living in this totally different reality now. And I'm asking the question, how can I serve God here? In this reality? Not the one that I dream about, in a sense, not the one that I'd really like, but the one I'm actually in. So yeah, that's a significant issue, I think. Yeah.
For me, it begs the question of what we are talking about being, what is our new church? What's the church going to look like for us?
Okay. Yeah. And Bonhoeffer is clearly already thinking about that. He's by this time, I think he's pretty clear in his own mind that this war is going to only end in one way, in the destruction of Germany. And we're going to have to put the pieces. But yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. And so he's asking the question, you know, we're going to have to rebuild our lives, our nations, our civilization, and our churches. And what's that going to look like? Are we just going to say, okay, just forget the last 6 years, everything is going to be like it was before? And he wants to say, we can't do that, right? That's not going to work. We might try to do that, but ultimately we're going to have to face this radically new situation that we're in, and come up with an appropriate response to it. Yeah.
Do you think that he saw religion as a creator of animosity, the different religions? I'm relating that to today also, that religion is used as a way that people just hate each other.
He doesn't bring out that theme so much. I think he was kind of conscious of that. But the way in which maybe his ideas would get at that would be to say that religion can become something that wants to preserve itself, right? So, it becomes defensive and closed in on itself. And the message of the gospel, Bonhoeffer had been saying, kind of relentlessly, ever since the rise of the Nazis, is one of inclusion. It's not who you exclude, it's who you include that makes you a Christian, right? So the idea that religion is always kind of this defensive posture over against the world and over against other points of view is something that he just didn't think there was a future in that.
Control and authority,
Right.
which they've been through
Mm-hmm.
in spades,
Yeah.
instead of where is Jesus going, and it might be somewhere we didn't expect,
Right.
which might turn things on their head.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And perhaps something that comes to my mind in one of your handouts was perhaps the compelling reason for coming back was to have a hand in the restoration of what he foresaw was a great conflict. And now he's put into a position of helplessness, essentially in prison,
Right.
except by his words, not his
Right.
actions.
Yeah, yeah. Another reason I think he wanted to get these ideas down on paper, because he's saying, I might or might not get out of here and have a future. But maybe if I give people some suggestions, right, then I can have some part in, the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's very important to kind of point out that he's asking questions here. He's not giving answers. He's not saying, I've got this all figured out. He's saying, what I figured out is at least what questions we should be asking. But how we're going to answer those questions, that's something I might have a hint of that, but I don't claim to have everything all organized. But he does say, what is how does he put it? What is a congregation, a liturgy, a sermon, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? And some people have read that and they've said that was a rhetorical question to which the implied answer was nothing. And nothing could be further from the truth, in my view. He's basically saying all of these things will continue to be meaningful, but we might have to understand their meaning in a different way. Right? The church is still, in his view, Christ existing as community in the world, but what that looks like might be very different in the future than what we've assumed it ought to look like in the past. Of course, one of the questions that we have to answer is, in order to understand what this idea of religionless Christianity is all about, is what did Bonhoeffer mean by religion? We don't know what it means for Christianity to be religionless unless we know what religion is. And Bonhoeffer is using the term religion as a term of art, you might say. He has a very specific meaning in mind, which I think he had worked out with Bethke and with other people in the past, but he's not necessarily going through all of that. He's just kind of throwing out kind of hints to kind of remind Bethke, yeah, this is kind of what I mean by religion. And I think that there are two streams, you might say, that kind of flow together here. One stream comes from the thought of Karl Barth, who we've already noted was very influential on Bonhoeffer's theology. And Barth had advanced a critique of religion, which he said is always our human effort to control, manipulate, kind of govern our relationship with God. It's law and works as opposed to grace, the gospel and faith, he would say. At least that's how it manifests itself within Christianity. Christianity is always in danger of becoming religious, Barth would say. And the radical message of the grace of God that we find in the New Testament, particularly, Barth would say, should, in a sense, defend us from that. But human beings being what they are, we all tend to just eventually kind of go back to this religious notion that the whole point of religion is so that we can somehow control our relationship to God and the universe. So Christianity always has to be on its guard against religion. That's one stream that Bonhoeffer has in mind. Another stream is really one that comes maybe from some secular thinkers, maybe Nietzsche, Interestingly, Bonhoeffer was very strongly influenced by Nietzsche. He didn't agree with all of his ideas, but you know, his thought was marked by Nietzsche's influence in some ways, and by Wilhelm Dilthey, a German philosopher and historian who himself was kind of unpacking some of Nietzsche's ideas. And in this case, religion is a kind of metaphysical or inward spiritual effort to control or escape the world. Right? Religion is kind of how we either escape from the world into a kind of fantasy world or seek to control the world. And sometimes we do both. Right? We escape into our private spirituality, but we also kind of want the forces of religion to be strong so that, you know, they can control our the world around us so that our fantasies aren't disrupted. That's a rather extreme critique of religion, you might say. But Bonhoeffer was willing to go there in some ways. And so you get both of these streams, and at certain points he seems to be talking more about Barth's view of religion, in other cases more about Dilthey's view of religion. I'm not advancing here. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So Bonhoeffer really says what we need is really a way of understanding biblical concepts, right? That should be kind of anchor our theology. We need a way of understanding those biblical concepts that is not religious. Our religion has to be biblical, but that doesn't mean it has to be religious, Bonhoeffer would say. So we need a non-religious interpretation of biblical concepts. For Bonhoeffer, as always, as we've seen, you know, throughout his life and thought, Christology is going to be the key to that. Okay? Christ reveals to us that God loves the world as world. Okay? God, you know, came into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world might have life through him. He would quote, you know, from John 3:16 and 17. And so his ideas about Jesus Christ as the man for others, the man who, the person who is, in a sense, totally for others, not for one's own self, right? That's going to be very important for him. At one point, Bonhoeffer says, only the suffering God can help. What we see in Jesus Christ is that God helps us through suffering, not through the imposition of power from above, so to speak, but from sharing the suffering of the world from within. Christian life, therefore, needs to be a life lived for others, right? If we're going to model our existence, in a sense, on Jesus Christ, right? If we're going to be conformed to Christ's vicarious representative action, then our lives need to be lived for others. Christ, he said, should be at the center of our lives, not merely at the boundaries. Okay? God is not just the answer to the questions we haven't figured out the answers to yet. If we accept that view of, you know, sometimes people would talk today about the God of the gaps theory. Whenever we have a gap in our knowledge or in our power, we appeal to God. Well, God will take care of that, or God explains that. Bonhoeffer says that the whole, in a sense, history of Western culture, at any rate, over the last 300 or 400 years has been characterized by the rise of the natural sciences, which now basically say that a lot of the things, if not all of the things that we used to refer to God to explain, we can now explain in terms of natural causality. Should Christians feel threatened by that? Should they feel that somehow we're reducing the space for God in the world as a result? that we have less and less room for God. We're pushing God farther and farther out onto the boundaries of our knowledge as our knowledge increases. That's a losing proposition, Bonhoeffer says, and that's really not what the Bible is about anyway. That's not what the gospel is about. It's not about God being used as a stopgap or as a deus ex machina. I think our textbook really emphasizes that idea of God as a deus ex machina. The reference there to ancient Greek and Roman theater, where a divinity would kind of drop out of the stage works at the end of the play and resolve all the conflicts, and then, be pulled back up into the stage works. Well, if our God is like that, if God just shows up when we can't do the job ourselves, then we're going to have less and less use for God as we become more and more knowledgeable and capable ourselves. But maybe that's not what it's been about all along anyway. Well, I handed out some passages last week. If you've got those, you might want to take a look at them. I'm afraid not, but I have excerpted them here on the slides. So the first one comes from that baptism sermon that I already talked about, that Bonhoeffer wrote for the baptism of Eberhard Bethge's son, who was named Dietrich Bethge. I always kind of wondered what happened to him, and I found out eventually. He became a musician, which is not surprising, since the Bethges and the Schleichers were both very, and the Bonhoeffers were all very musical. Became a cellist who played in the London Symphony Orchestra. So, just interesting factoid there. But Bonhoeffer wrote this sermon, as many baptism sermons are. It's kind of designed as a letter to the baptized infant that will be read later on, of course, right? Because the infant isn't capable of reading it at that point. But it's kind of a reflection on the meaning of baptism and the meaning of the world into which you have been born and into which you're going to be growing up. And so Bonhoeffer says, as part of that letter is kind of the final paragraph, you might call it the peroration of the letter, right? The point where Bonhoeffer is really saying, this is what it's all about. And so Bonhoeffer says, our church, and I think he's referring to the confessing church in Germany, and in a sense to himself as well, perhaps, says, our church has been fighting during these years only for its self-preservation, as if that were an end in itself. It has become incapable of bringing the word of reconciliation and redemption to the world. So the words we used before must lose their power, be silenced. And we can be Christians today in only two ways, through prayer and in doing justice among human beings. All Christian thinking, talking, and organizing must be born anew out of that prayer and action. That's one of the really famous Bonhoeffer quotations there, right? That people have been puzzling about. What exactly did they mean by that? And then he goes on to say, it is not for us to predict the day, but the day will come, he says, when people will once more be called upon to speak the word of God in such a way that the world will be changed and renewed. It will be a new language, perhaps quite non-religious language, but liberating and redeeming like Jesus' language, so that people will be alarmed and yet overcome by its power, the language of a new righteousness and truth, a language proclaiming that God makes peace with humankind and that God's kingdom is drawing near. So you can kind of hear some echoes in some ways of his very highly Christological thinking. The next one that I want to look at is a poem. It's a poem that's actually reproduced in its entirety in our book. They use, as I suppose would make sense, they use the translation that is included in the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works volume. I tend to think that as much as I admire that translation, I don't think they did such a hot job on the poetry. They needed a poet to do the translation. I think the 1971 translation is actually much better. It makes a better poem, you might say. So I've reproduced that here. The poem is called Christians and Pagans. That's one thing that kind of bothered the later editors, that use of the word pagans didn't seem very polite, not very politically correct. Well, Bonhoeffer wasn't politically correct by our standards because he lived when he lived, right? But what he means by the term pagans is not something at all insulting, as I think we'll see. So, the first stanza of the poem is, men go to God when they are sore bestead. Sore bestead is old-fashioned terminology, but Bonhoeffer likes some of that old-fashioned terminology, actually. It means when we're in a desperate situation, right? They pray to him for succor, for help, for his peace, for bread, for mercy for them sick, sinning, or dead. All men do so, Christian and unbelieving. So we might say Bonhoeffer is kind of alluding there to the notion of a religious understanding of God, right? God is there to help us when we can't help ourselves. God's there at the boundaries, kind of to help us figure out the things that we can't figure out. The next stanza is kind of interesting. Men go to God when he is sore bestead. Find him poor and scorned, without shelter or bread, whelmed under the weight of the wicked, the weak, the dead. Christians stand by God in his hour of grieving. What do you think he's talking about there?
The religionless versus the religious.
Was it?
The religionless versus the religious.
Okay, yeah, I think he's kind of just sketching a vision of what a religionless Christianity might be, and it's a very Christological vision, isn't it? Right? He's kind of talking about standing by Jesus, right? As Jesus suffers in the life of the world. And then the last stanza is, God goes to every man when sore bestead, feeds body and spirit with his bread. For Christians, pagans alike he hangs dead, and both alike forgiving. So in a sense, we're not saved by our religion. We're not really damned by it either, according to Bonhoeffer, because ultimately, God's grace and God's forgiveness is kind of universal. There's a suggestion here, I think, and it's kind of interesting that Bonhoeffer, living in the midst of the Third Reich, is willing basically to say, the grace of God is truly universal. I want to make sure that I get some comments about this letter in. This letter comes from the 21st of July, 1944, and it's addressed to his friend Eberhard Bethge. So, what do we know about the history of Bonhoeffer's imprisonment that might make this letter significant? What's that? Very soon before the end of his life, yeah, but it's 1944, so he's still got, it's April of 45 when, but it might be
the day after the failed attempt at
okay. It's the day after the failure of Operation Valkyrie. And of course, everyone in the prison knew about it at that point. And so Bonhoeffer, of course, makes no reference to it at all in the letter. He'd be crazy to do that, because these letters might be discovered. But it's pretty clear that he's kind of responding, reacting, and kind of assessing his situation in the light of that. And he says in that letter, In the last few years, I have come to know and understand more and more the profound this-worldliness of Christianity. The Christian is not a homo religiosus, but simply a human being in the same way that Jesus was a human being. I do not mean the shallow and banal this-worldliness of the enlightened, the busy, the comfortable, or the lascivious, but the profound this-worldliness that shows discipline and includes the ever-present knowledge of death and resurrection. I think Luther lived in this kind of this-worldliness, he says. And then he goes on, if one has completely renounced making something of oneself, then one throws oneself completely into the arms of God, and this is what I call this-worldliness, living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. Then one takes seriously not one's own sufferings, but those of God in the world. Then one stays awake with Christ in Gethsemane. I think that's a really powerful image. I'm a little iffy, a little up and down about a lot of the cartoons in our textbook. I think some of them I kind of wonder about. But there is one very powerful one on page 137 for those of you who have the book. I've got it here too, but I seem to have misplaced it. That essentially shows Bonhoeffer staying awake with Christ in Gethsemane. And I think that for him was an extremely powerful image of what it means to be a Christian. And then he goes on, how should one become arrogant over successes or shaken by one's failures? I think there's the allusion to the circumstances that he was in. When one shares in God's sufferings in the life of the world. You understand what I mean, even when I put it so briefly. I am grateful that I have been allowed this insight, and I know that it is only on the path that I have finally taken that I was able to learn this. So I am thinking gratefully and with peace of mind about past as well as present things. One of the quotations that we looked at last week, Bonhoeffer was similarly reflecting on his life since he had returned to Germany from America. And saying, I don't regret it. I think I did the right thing. This was what I was being called to do. And I'm going to have to understand my life, however short it may be from this point on, as essentially complete. Right? Insofar as I kind of feel as if I have been able to follow the call of God. There's one more set of quotations that we're not really going to have time to get into today, but they come from one of the last documents that we have from Bonhoeffer in terms of the chronology of his writing, and it's what he calls an outline for a book. So I think we'll maybe start there next week, and it's where Bonhoeffer is trying in maybe a more systematic way to say, this is the message that I want to give to the future, and particularly to Christians in the future, and particularly to Christians in Germany in the future. This is what it might mean for us to essentially, rebuild our lives and rebuild our churches and rebuild our faith in such a way that we can truly call ourselves, the Church of Jesus Christ. So we'll start there next week, and then we'll move into talking about how Bonhoeffer's ideas were received in the world and some of the controversies that have surrounded trying to figure out what exactly he meant and how it might kind of apply to our own lives. Okay, thank you.